Okay, so we're talking about 19th century civil rights activists, and this is just meant to be a broad overview. We will be going on and talking about some of the other activists more in depth, especially the abolitionists. But there right now is just going to be a broad overview. The 19th century issues are the issues going on that had been going on for a long time, but larger groups of people were starting to talk about it in the 19th century, were things like the enslavement of people in the United States, which had started in the 1600s, the lack of public education, so most people could not get access to education, women's inability to own property, to go to college and to grad school, and not be able to vote, criminals who were mixed in with mentally ill people in horrible jails, alcoholism, and lack of medical care. And some of the people that were trying to really fight to make change were these people. Some of them might look familiar and some of them may not be familiar. The anti-slavery, so the abolitionists, were using a variety of means or methods to achieve their ends. Things such as speeches, writing books about what slavery was like. Examples of this is the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass and Uncle Tom's Cabin. Newspapers, helping people to escape, appealing to government officials, especially to Lincoln. And people like Harriet Tubman, Abraham Lincoln was part of that, although he was more the one who was influenced by other important people. John Brown did raise awareness, although his method was a little bit more violent. Sarah and Angelina Grimke, who were sisters who lived on a slave plantation and were appalled by what they saw. Denmark Vesey, who was an abolitionist, and William Lloyd Garrison. Another famous example is Frederick Douglass. He is famous because he worked really hard to end slavery after he fled Baltimore and got on a train and forged some papers and got to New York, and a friend helped him out. He was part of what was called a vigilance committee. And that vigilance, one of the guys gave him some money and got him started. Frederick Bailey was his first name, and he eventually became Frederick Douglass. He made speeches. He published a newspaper called the North Star. He then, later in his life, wrote the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass to show people just how horrible slavery was. And then later, when Abraham Lincoln was elected, he worked and met with Abraham Lincoln to try to convince him to let African Americans participate in the war, which eventually Lincoln did. Then Frederick Douglass met with Lincoln to try to get African Americans equal pay in the military, which did not work. But he did successfully convince Lincoln to end slavery using the 13th Amendment. In terms of women's rights, women did not have the right to own their own property, divorce from bad marriages, sue from the abuse if there was abuse going on. They were not allowed to go to college, and then sometimes not allowed to go to, and definitely not allowed to go to graduate school, even if they were allowed to go to college. They weren't allowed to vote, and they were not allowed to work at their own jobs, especially like wealthier women. Like the only jobs available to them were like servants and factory jobs. Like, so they couldn't be lawyers, that they couldn't be doctors. So women's activists wrote speeches, they held a convention, they kept trying to apply to medical school, supported the anti-slavery movement, and worked together. So these are some of the women who were working really hard for activism. Elizabeth Blackwell is one of those examples. She worked really hard. She wanted to be a doctor, and so she applied to a ton of medical schools and eventually finally got accepted and became a doctor and opened her own practice. Horace Mann saw the problem of public education. Very few people could go to school unless you had enough money for fancy tutors. So Horace Mann took it upon himself to do something about it. He got himself elected into the government and the Massachusetts legislature, so our lawmaking branch. He put into place laws that gave every kid in Massachusetts access to school using property taxes. Other states liked it, and so they used the idea too. He also was a big proponent or a person who advocated for teaching teacher schools that would teach teachers how to teach. Another problem was in the criminal and mental health system. Criminals and mental health patients were put in the same place. It was really nasty and ugly. Jailers could beat patients. There were terrible cells with little to no food, and there was chains on the prisoners. So Dorothea Dix documented all the conditions in the prisons around Massachusetts and presented her shocking findings to the legislature. Dix was successful at getting mental health hospitals made in Massachusetts, New York, and Rhode Island. Gallaudet founded the first school for the deaf because there weren't a lot of schools available, and his university still stands today in Washington, D.C. Henry David Thoreau was what were called a transcendentalist. He wrote the book Civil Disobedience, which basically said the principle that if the government is doing something that is morally unjust, then you have the right to disobey it in a very super peaceful manner. So he influenced Gandhi, who led a very peaceful way of disobeying segregation laws in India, and Martin Luther King, who led the civil rights movement with thousands of people participating in civil disobedience to protest all of the segregation laws. So that is an overview of the reform movements of the 19th century.